Well, that was amazing, yes. So I also want to encourage you to use the Twitter/Skype so that we can generate a healthy discussion here with our speakers today, and that will help us to really communicate together about where we're going in terms of addressing all the issues that were raised by Dr. Williams. What I'd like to do now is to offer our discussants an opportunity to speak. So we have Dr. LaVeist, and we also have Reverend Bradley, and we would like to get their comments. Would you like to stay there, or would you like to?
I'll sit here.
Okay.
It's all the same to me.
Yes, sir.
Am I first? So I have to follow that. Yeah, David and I were graduate students together 100 years ago. So
at the University of Michigan.
At University of
Michigan.
Michigan. Okay, University of Michigan. So nothing that I heard this morning surprised me. It was kind of what I expected, and I had no clue how I was going to respond to that. Because actually, I would agree with much of what was said. You know, much of my work is in the area of structural racism, focusing on segregation and how it impacts health. Interesting, David's done a lot of work on everyday racism, which is really more about interpersonal racism and health. But I want to kind of talk about, make one comment about structural racism, because I think David said it all. And then I want to shift and talk about that third form of racism, the one that we haven't really talked about that much in his talk and hasn't gotten as much coverage in the research. So first on structural racism, we recently, to kind of piggyback on what David was saying about how structural racism is manifested through segregation and how segregation was intentionally created. You know, you have to talk about redlining in this country. And this was a policy that began in the early 20th century, ending right around after World War II. We recently have done analysis here in Baltimore showing that among neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1920s, there's an average difference in life expectancy of about 11 years. When we take all of the cities across the country and put them together, we've replicated that analysis across many different cities, seeing similar patterns. Redlining, even above poverty, even once you adjust for poverty rates, redlining has an independent impact on health outcomes. We look at what happened about a year ago here in this city over in West Baltimore. West Baltimore was a classic example of community that was redlined. There was nothing surprising to me about what happened last year. It was the only thing that surprised me is that it didn't happen sooner, because all of the structural necessities that would create a tinderbox like that had been there forever. The other point that I want to make is really about internalized racism, and it's the area that we don't really talk as much about because we really don't have as strong a research base on that topic as we do for structural and interpersonal racism. But, you know, David made a point about when cops stereotype black citizens and then we have these tragedies occur, that they're not necessarily being bad cops, they're being normal Americans. But I want to put this on the table, and that is that African Americans are Americans too. And that African Americans also can internalize these negative stereotypes and beliefs about other African Americans and find themselves engaging in similar behavior. So black American culture is a very young culture, at least from the standpoint of world cultures. It begins in the 1600s when Europeans discover that there's another side of the planet and that there are natural resources on that other side of the planet, and decide that we're going to kidnap people from the southern part of that part of the planet and bring them over to the other side and use their labor to extract those natural resources. And when those Africans were put into the hulls of the slave ship, they did what people do. They created a culture that was an amalgam of the many different cultures that they came from. And that culture was designed to survive the Middle Passage, slavery, and Jim Crow segregation. And from that perspective, it has been a massively successful culture, to have been born out of such challenge and grief, and for us to still be here today. But that culture needs to continue to evolve to the challenges of today. So one easy example would be the issue of diet, where you take organ meats and other forms of other parts of animals that people didn't really even eat, and have the resiliency and the creativity to create from that an internationally renowned cuisine. But now that we live in the 21st century in a sodium-rich environment, eating high-sodium foods is not conducive to survival. So many of the strategies, mistrust of medical care, evolved as a cultural dynamic. It evolved out of a very real reality. In fact, if you didn't mistrust medical care, something must be wrong with you because of all the untrustworthy behavior. It's okay. I was part of the Hopkins community for 25 years. It's okay. I only retired a month ago. It's all right. I'm still one of you. It's good. All good. It all happened, right? So that untrustworthy behavior led to distrust. But now it's not as functional to have that distrust, right? Because, we do need medical care. So there are aspects of the culture, there are ways that racism has impacted health on many different levels, not only structural and interpersonal, but also internalized. And I think I'd love to see us begin to do more research in that area. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my panelist colleagues. Thank you.
Can I take your mic?
You can have this.
It's already hot, so I'm gonna keep that going. So I'm a seedling in this lineup here, and I'm happy to be that. So I prepared my comments in a written text. Like preachers can kind of have two different ways. You can preach extemporaneously, or you can write it down so you get everything you need to get out. And so if you'll indulge me, I have some comments. Given the vast degree of expertise of our presenters, I really was confident that Drs. Williams and LaVeist would make an adequate case regarding racism's impact on health. So that left me to really think deeply about what my contribution might be. And so I've entitled my comments, "Racism Ain't That Well Behaved," situating anti-racism research and practice in public health for the future. And essentially this title is to remind us that racism never acts alone in the wreak of its havoc. It thrives in collaboration and collusion with a host of other oppressions acting simultaneously to impact health. Bell Hooks refers to the overarching apparatus to which racism is linked as the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And she uses this language as an approximation to identify the interlocking system of domination, and secondly, to avoid specifying any one oppression as more important than any other. And then lastly, to reflect that all of these are operating simultaneously in our lives, and that no one aspect can be adequately understood by examining a singular oppression. Dr. Patricia Hill Collins, in her book Black Sexual Politics, discusses how gender has emerged as a prominent feature of what some call the new racism, but that many see sexism, for example, as a secondary concern that will best be addressed once we get through this racism thing, right? And she answers that by saying, if racism and sexism are deeply intertwined, and they are, racism can never be solved without seeing and challenging sexism. So in the spirit of this logic, my hope for these remarks is that we advance the work of linking racism and population health by thinking about the mechanisms and strategies that move us away from a monolithic capture of racism to ones that are inclusive of a broader model and framework as originally defined by the intellect and lived experiences of black feminist scholars as early as Sojourner Truth, who said, "Ain't I a woman?" In 1982, the Combahee River Collective, a community organizing initiative of a small group of African-American women in Boston, framed this idea so well in a paper titled A Black Feminist Statement. And in it, they argued that race-only or gender-only frameworks advance partial and incomplete analyses of social injustices. And the statement goes on to proclaim that liberation requires a comprehensive response to multiple systems of oppression. oppression. And then the Black Lives Matter movement is another more contemporary exemplar of this inclusion, articulated by Alicia Garza, one of the founders, a Black queer feminist woman. She says of Black Lives Matter, it goes beyond the narrow nationalism that can be prevalent within some Black communities, keeping straight, cis Black men in the front of the movement while our sisters, queer and trans and disabled folk take up roles in the background or not at all. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. So to press this idea a little further, let's consider the interlocking nature of multiple oppressions in an analysis of the health disparity of HIV in the Black community. We know that Blacks are diagnosed at much higher rates than their white counterparts and have poorer treatment outcomes, particularly among subgroups, for example, Black women or Black men in the exposure category of men who have sex with men when compared with their white counterparts. Race and racism as a singular level construct, as you know, does not adequately help us get at that disparity. We have to also ask the questions, how do racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, neoliberalism work together and lead us to the discovery of how oppression manifests? We can, however, look at the matrix of domination as developed and put forth by Black feminist scholar Dr. Patricia Hill Collins and the intersectionality framework significantly and poignantly articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, which echoes generations of Black feminist thinking and scholars. And these guide our research and praxis so that we facilitate an understanding of how various power relations mutually influence and co-produce each other simultaneously at multiple levels, leading to poor health. But first, y'all, we got to get comfortable with the fact that working and living at the intersections is complicated and messy. Can you say complicated and messy, right? So our analysis will probably also be complicated and messy, potentially to the upset of the colonial positivist reductionist epistemology to which our science aspires. So while it is rigorous science to control for confounding and important to the work, we need to give the cultural side eye to studies that highlight one oppression without understanding its collusion and intersection, because life really isn't that controlled. Though there is a need for a methodological revolution to advance the use of these frameworks, Dr. Bolek says we don't need to wait on that before we start applying them. And that an intersectionality-informed stance in our initiation of hypotheses, study design, instrument development, data collection, and interpretation helps us, in her words, embrace rather than avoid the essential complexities. And also the use of narratives in our studies is also a method that provides a form to understand the ways in which interlocking oppressions play out. It's not soft science, okay? Now let's turn to consider how these frameworks situate our anti-racist praxis. At this point, I would cue the organist that I'm getting ready to close. So, anti-racist work cannot be done in isolation, and it requires solidarity, is the point that I hope to make. While I maintain it is still appropriate to have strategy and action that's centered around Blackness without other non-Black communities of color, our work should seek opportunities to connect struggles across race, class, gender, nationality, sexuality, and ability. And Dr. Collins raises this question, and I'm directly quoting her question: how can we transcend the barriers created by our experiences with race and class and gender oppression in order to build the types of coalitions essential for social change? And she talks about the framework's utility among young people who have engaged in intersectionality in venues and ways that are subversive to scholarly scrutiny and give power to perspectives that are not typically represented in traditional resistance. And so we also know that it can an expansive understanding of intersectionality serves as a really important critical tool for political engagement. Moreover, when we're looking at the levels of domination structured along multiple axes, it gives us an insight into the potential sites of resistance and action. So, in conclusion, I believe holding this insight safeguards our anti-racist praxis, scholarship, knowledge production, and analysis against falling into binaries, categorical essentialism, and monolithic analyses and strategies, because as we all know, the lines don't fall so neatly. And even more consequential, I caution that if we do not think beyond a monocategorical framework, then we will find that those with the newly acquired rights will have become the oppressors themselves.
Amen. So we have some responses from our audience. They have some questions for you. The first is, how can everyday people tackle large structural and systematic issues of oppression and bias?
I think where there's unity, there's power. I don't think we have fully acknowledged the power that we can wield when we come together as one and speak with one voice and make issues a priority. All politicians listen to what their constituencies have to say and pay great attention to it. But if we are completely apathetic and have nothing to say, they listen to what their funders, those who provide them financial support, say. So I think it will take fighting against, to use a biblical analogy, the principalities and powers.
Yes, sir.
To dismantle racism, because you have to realize we have a structure in place that there are powerful forces that benefit from the status quo and don't want change because that's where their gravy is coming from. So, but it will take a united movement to say we need to do things differently, and I think we have to come together with this as a priority, and in a united fashion we can exert enormous power.
And I think that everyday people can acknowledge your power, acknowledge your privilege, and don't get guilty and tripping about having either of them, and use them in service to the deconstruction of the forces of oppression and power. I think we had a discussion at Bloomberg about politically correct language, and I think there's this idea that politically correct language is only for white-skinned people or people who identify as white. But we and I need to constantly be checking my language, because the world is constructed based on the language that we use, the terminology that we use. So when I'm in a space and say, hey guys, I even check myself and say, that's assuming that men are the dominant in this group, and so there are women. So I think we can do that by challenging ourselves. Yes, you, my black brother, you even challenge the language that you use and the way that you experience privilege in your life, so that we are dealing with racism and all of his or her brothers and sisters.
And there was a follow-up question to that one, which was, what would a system-wide methodological solution to bias look like for those advocates?
System-wide. Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, what do system-wide methodological solutions to bias look like for those advocates? So you've got the people doing this. What does it look like? How does it play out? An example might have been the educational change that occurred in Atlanta. What would that look like here?
So let me say two things, because that question might be premised. I was joining Barbara Reskin's work that racism is a system, and you need to have exogenous shocks that changes the entire system. I would suggest going to a paper, because I don't have time to explain everything, but she shows why the civil rights movement, although it accomplished a lot of good, did not accomplish as much as it could have, because there wasn't the systems in place across different institutions of American society where you had accountability to ensure that the equality that was was passed by civil rights legislation, rarely became a reality, and if you can have all the legislation you want, how it is implemented makes an enormous difference, and whether there's accountability built into it. So she actually analyzes the failures of the civil rights movement. It accomplished much, but it could have accomplished more because there was inattention to the systemic accountability across systems ensuring that results were produced. So there are ways in which it can be done. But the other bigger point, and this is the point about the purpose-built communities in Atlanta as well, what they did, which is very different than the traditional approach where we try to address one problem in the community, they said we will not be successful unless we address all of the problems in society simultaneously. We need to address the schools and the crime and employment and housing and neighborhood quality, and you can go on, simultaneously. It's taking a comprehensive approach as opposed to the piecemeal approach, which is the typical way we function.
I would add to that, and I would caution that by focusing only on structural issues, that the structure is the problem, but in exogenous shocks to the system certainly would be a solution. But there can also be endogenous shocks. In other words, those of us that are within the system do have some agency, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to use whatever power we have when we have that power to try to make progress, even if it's within a system. So we can't just wait for the system to fall away before we'll have a society that is not fundamentally racist.
I agree.
So I have a couple of questions for you all. Feel free to send me some more questions here, but one of the questions I have, and maybe it's a little bit of me outside of my role as a researcher and a clinician, but maybe as a parent. Derek Bell has a book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and he talks about the permanence of racism. And there's even this story where he talks this story called Space Traders, which is one of the favorite chapters for me. But I want you all to comment maybe on, is it permanent? So what do we tell sort of the future? There have been some studies, more recent studies. A teenager actually did a study which was featured in the Smithsonian where they looked at internalized racism in young children and demonstrated in her video, it was teen film working in New York City, actually demonstrated how young children have already internalized those things. So I'm wondering what the future looks like and how we're able to do some prevention from a public health perspective in terms of this permanence of racism.
All right, let me begin. Dr. LaVeist asked if there are any easy questions. Let me begin by saying racism will be permanent if we are happy with the status quo and allow it to become permanent. We can make a difference, and we can work to change it. Changing it is not easy because I agree with Dr. LaVeist. We have to think of changing it at an institutional level. We need to think of changing it at a cultural level. In the one example, we can make more progress in the cultural space than we have asked for or we have demanded. There are a number of studies that have shown how, and I'm not trying to suggest that the problem has been solved, but if you look at the cultural acceptance for the LGBT population in the United States, there has been remarkable transformation in the last 20 years. That has not occurred by chance. There are a number of studies of deliberate, calculated attempts to change the culture and how we perceive LGBT populations, primarily through media representations of them. We have not had a similar campaign, and there's a science literature, I've written about it in a paper about reducing racism. We haven't applied that same deliberate strategy to African Americans. So for example, there's a research paper published in Science that shows although there are more African American actors on television today, there is more negative nonverbal behavior directed towards African American characters than to status match white characters, and that whites who see that, even though they are unaware, I'm talking about nonverbal behavior, they are adversely affected, and it heightens their prejudice against African Americans. So I'm saying there's a whole area of work we have to do in terms of addressing the cultural institutions, from the church to the media to our educational institutions, to change the culture. It's not going to happen on its own, so there's a lot that can be done. And those are just examples of things that can be done, but it has to be deliberate, it has to be concerted, it has to be a repetitive strategy.
I have questions coming from everywhere now. For desegregation, is it better to have policies that actively integrate communities or passive ones like eliminating property tax as the basis of school funding?
Well, I don't think that's an either or. I mean, I think we need is both. We need policies that try to achieve equity. In other words, not policies that treat people equitable necessarily, but policies that try to achieve equity. And I think that would necessitate two different strategies, both more passive, as you suggest, which would be, decoupling community-based tax collection to schools, but also policies that seek to transform communities.
Let me add to that one important perspective when I talked about how central segregation was. Desegregation is one solution to segregation. But I would also emphasize there's nothing inherently negative about living next to people of your own race. So the problems of segregation is not segregation per se. It's what William Julius Wilson calls the concentration effects of all the social ills that co-occur with segregation. Someone shouldn't have to move out of their community to live in a better community. So you can also envision, instead of a desegregation strategy, you can think of a Marshall Plan for disadvantaged communities in the United States that will build in the opportunity structures and the high-quality schools and the high-quality access to opportunity that will solve the problem. But without that kind of commitment and investment, we're not going to get there.
And it's not only low-income communities. If you look at Prince George's County, which is widely touted as the most affluent black community in the country, we still don't have a major shopping mall. We still don't have many major restaurants in Prince George's County. That's not because of the economic status of the people living there. It clearly isn't when you look at what the income levels are. So racism operates on multiple levels, and income interacts, but there's clearly a direct effect of race as well. So just living in so there is that reality of, okay, if you're going to purchase a home, do you purchase a home in this affluent black community where property values are not going to appreciate, where you're not going to get the same services and amenities because of segregation, or do you purchase that home in another community where you have greater opportunity to build wealth because of the appreciation of the property? So there's a lot of complexity to all of this as well.
So I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to offer them a few last words so that we could wrap up this session. So if you have any departing words of encouragement or wisdom that you'd like to share with our audience.
I have a word of wisdom from W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1899, he wrote a book entitled The Philadelphia Negro. He has a chapter in that book on Negro health. In the chapter on Negro health, Du Bois wrote, "The most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race." And he continued, "There have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. The racial differences in health is equivalent to 265 black people dying prematurely every day. Congress would move heaven and earth if there was a jumbo jet with 265 passengers and crew that crashed every single day in the United States. But as a society, we sit back and we accept it. I think we need to think of how can we work together to tell the story of the disadvantaged in a way that cuts through this peculiar indifference that we struggle with in the United States. And I think that's a huge priority for us to work to figure out ways that we can engage. Most Americans are compassionate people. Most Americans are kind and loving people. How can we tell the story in a way that cuts through their blinders and helps to overcome the peculiar indifference so we can build a political movement and have the political will to make a difference?
So once again, I'm supposed to follow that, right?
You got it.
No, I do have it. I would say that, I would end with a word to each and every one of you in this room, and those of you listening online, that wherever you are, you have some agency, you have some power to make some change, to do something. So if wherever you are, you see inequalities, some inequitable situation, that you have an opportunity to impact. It's okay if you are the only black or Latino or woman in the room when you enter the organization. But it's not okay if it's still that way when you leave. So there's an so I would also point out that there are people all over this country that are making a difference. One of the projects that I'm working on is a documentary film where we're working on this very issue, and where we're going to show people that are making a difference. There are many people in this room that I've eyeballed, some of you in the audience, people that I know are personally doing things through their organizations or as individuals that are making a difference. We need to lift those people up as well. We need to make sure that everyone knows about the great work that those people are doing. I won't start calling names because I know I'll leave people out. But we need to make sure people know about that work. We need to support each other in doing that work and understand that every little step that we take towards eliminating a racist system, every little step is moving us one step closer to that reality.
I will end with what I think is appropriate as a personal reflection and thinking about in the Judaic and Christian tradition of David as a young lad up against Goliath, and so there's a David at the table, amazingly. And I think that you can have David collected several smooth stones, but he only needed one to take down Goliath. And so I think to this idea of intersectionality and all of the different forces that we need to work against, if anti-racism is the one smooth stone that you do use, understand that what you're taking down is much greater than just racism.